Hello my friends, more and more of you are joining this channel, which now has a large audience including many professionals and many pilots. And you asked me to talk about Air France 447. I had a hard time at first, I won't hide it from you because much of my audience is from France. This accident happened in summer 2009. For many, it still feels like yesterday. There are still a lot of emotions attached to this tragedy, and that's why at first I was hesitant. I didn't want to talk about it, but today I will. And I'd still like to tell you something, that in this video there isn't any direct or indirect attack or explicit or implicit towards the people involved in this tragedy, whether they are the pilots, Air France, Airbus. Even if sometimes I make classic comparisons between Airbus and Boeing, it's not to say that one is better than the other, it's just technical comparisons. To illustrate my point, well, that was, let's say, an introductory remark. More than that, there's a difficulty in this video, beyond the emotion I just described. It's the fact that when we talk about Airbus, we don't describe accidents in terms of oil and fuel. It will be about algorithms, it will be about equations. That sometimes makes things a bit more abstract. And I'll do my best to make it as simple as possible. I'll make a few small shortcuts, nothing major. It's just so the video doesn't last 2 days longer than it's already going to, okay? So let's get started. During the night of May 31st to June 1st, 2009, a terrible accident occurred. It was the loss of Air France's Airbus A330. The Rio-Paris flight was an aircraft that had taken off on Sunday evening around 10:30 post-meridian. It was supposed to arrive, in theory, the next day at Paris Charles de Gaulle. The aircraft began to head up through Brazil on a trajectory that was more or less northeast. It reached the ocean, and then a long part of its route would take it over the Atlantic Ocean. It would cross this area during the night. It would go from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. And then, at some point, it was supposed to appear on the other side near the African coast and start talking or communicating with air traffic control in Dakar. What we know is that he left the Brazilian coast and the controllers in Senegal never managed to establish contact. In the morning, as the morning went on, the worry was growing. Everyone was talking to everyone. A lot of controllers in France, Spain, Brazil, and the Canary Islands were wondering, where did he go? The Air France 447, an investigation to find this plane started around 8 o'clock in the morning. At first, we wondered if the flight was cancelled and they just forgot to notify us and deactivate the flight plan. That's not usually Air France's style, but it happens. Then, we confirmed that indeed it left. It really took off from Rio de Janeiro. People saw it leave. It left. That's it. But something must have happened over the ocean at 11:07 Paris time. This time, we know for sure that the plane crashed somewhere. Why? Because, quite simply, according to its flight plan, it had a range that didn't go beyond 11:07. So, at that point, if it didn't land somewhere and no airport reported seeing it, then it means it crashed somewhere. The search started. Initially, they discussed a disappearance, which may explain the emotion. Extremely strong, because there's a mysterious side to it at the beginning. It took them nearly 2 years, 23 months, to find the black boxes. It took them 5 days to confirm the first debriefings. At first, it was similar to the story of Malaysia Airlines, 370, the Malaysian Airlines Boeing 777 that vanished and was never found. Do you see the challenge for those interested in Malaysia Airlines 370? Notice that this Air France flight, which was following its path, literally following the marked trajectory to cross the ocean, which followed and stuck to its flight plan, in the end it was lost and it took 2 years to find it. Can you imagine if a plane like Malaysia Airlines 370 goes missing? Whether it strays from its path intentionally or unintentionally, the chances of finding it in this lifetime are extremely slim. Okay, to talk about our Airbus, we need to go back a little. We have to go back to California in the 1960s. In the 1960s in California, research was being done to develop fly-by-wire flight control laws. Why? Why is that? Why did we do that? Well, there are a lot of reasons. I can give you one, for example. The military was very interested in this. For this, look, let's imagine there's a flying plane, any plane, a military plane, a fighter jet, for example, and this is more or less its flight area. This rectangle schematically represents the flight area of our aircraft. The plane cost, let's say, $100 million, which means, in other words, we paid $100 million for this flight area. Now, what are the pilots going to do? The pilots are going to try to explore this flight area, all right? And maybe, on average, they use this part of the flight area. That means we've lost, if I look here, we've lost this entire area. We've lost $30 million worth of flight area. That can happen, okay? What can also happen is that we have a pilot who can be... It does this, leaves the flight area, and we've lost $100 million in flight area. At that point, the plane is either broken or has crashed, you see? So what we wanted a way, if you will, to maximize the performance of the aircraft and make sure it's being used to its full potential. In other words, if a fighter pilot sees in his rear view mirror or in his device there an attack detector, he sees a missile chasing him. We don't want him to have any hesitation or second thoughts about, for example, performing extreme maneuvers. To be able to save his plane and escape from that missile, we wouldn't want him to break his plane or lose control of it during the maneuver. Or, on the other hand, that he's too soft on the controls and gets hit by the missile. For example, just as an example, civilians were very interested in this technology, which was being developed in the 60s. They were eyeing this technology because, you see, civilian planes were getting bigger and bigger and becoming harder and harder to fly. What we really wanted to avoid was difficulty. We wanted to make a plane that was easy and pleasant to fly. We wanted to move away from that old-fashioned image of the captain struggling with his Boeing 707 or his Douglas Commercial 10 just to land it. That pilot sweating under his cap. That pilot who would be, in a way, like Eric Tabali or Eugene Rigwidel Desert fighting with their catamaran to keep it on course. We wanted to avoid that. There's no hidden motive. Because if we have a pilot who is rested, who is relaxed, who is assisted by the aircraft, then that's a pilot who might be able to scan all his instruments better, who will be more alert when a difficulty arises, who will be more present mentally and physically. It's not a pilot exhausted after 4 hours of flying. That's what we wanted. Besides, there are other reasons that I won't mention now, which would be too difficult or too long to talk about. In any case, they developed a flight law that we call, it's a law, the fundamental law actually, which will be used by Airbus later on, which we call the C-Star law. They also developed a variant called the C-Star U law. This one, I'll tell you right away, this is what's used by Boeing on its aircraft, which are fly-by-wire with electronic flight controls, like the Boeing 777 or the Boeing 787 as well, which uses this law, C-Star U. So what is this C-Star law? So this C-Star law, if we look at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration documents from that time, which by the way are not very easy to find. I even think that this video is the only one on the internet that explains or talks about the C-Star law. Look, the issue when it came up at Ames, that's my daughter who scribbled all over it. So the C-Star law came in response to this. If I look at the path an airplane takes, right? I look at the path an airplane takes. This path was divided into small points like that, into small segments, right? We place points and split the path into segments. Like that, we don't think about the whole path. We only think in small segments. And our goal is to go from one segment to the next. What are the fundamental data? Which do we start with? The fundamental data to solve the equation of this segment. Let's call it, I don't know, let's call it X, for example. To solve this X, we will use three functions. We will use a triplet of functions. So the first function is position as a function of time. The second function is velocity as a function of time. And the third function is acceleration as a function of time. You will notice that each one is a derivative of the other, all right? Each of these functions in reality will actually open up to three variables. That means we have the position as a function of x, the position as a function of y, the position as a function of z. Actually, these are the three coordinates in space. We will represent each of these functions by a vector. I told you, Airbus isn't about oil or gasoline. That's clear. So speed is the same, Vx, vertical velocity. And acceleration is the same, acceleration along x, acceleration along the y-axis, and acceleration along the z-axis. So we have these nine variables that are really at the origin, or that are really at the core of the electrical flight controls. These pieces of information here, these 9 variables, are inertial variables. I can put a little I everywhere. So I put an I here, and I here, and I here. To emphasize, I do it 9 times to emphasize. To emphasize. These variables you see here are inertial variables. Why are they inertial? Because when you have a plane moving, there are 2 ways to think about its movement. Movement occurs relative to both the earth and the air, since the air also moves. What interests us in this story of fly-by-wire controls is the movement relative to the earth. Because, let me show you. For example, I randomly select a chart with an approach chart. Rio de Janeiro, okay. I take this approach chart. The approach paths you see here, this descent plan, everything you see here. These are paths that are represented in relation to the ground. They are not paths represented in relation to the air. In that case, they would change from one moment to the next. When a plane is flying, it is following paths in relation to something solid, something concrete, like a runway, a mountain, or a beacon. We are following paths that are fixed in space, even though, of course, the air itself moves in all directions. Okay. So, as I was saying, we have 9 variables. To solve these variables, we're going to create a law called the C-star law. All right. Sometimes it's called C-star in English, C-star for star. And we're going to say that it's the unknown star, because the documentation on this C-star is extremely limited, as I said. So the C-star equation will look for to create a plane that can be flown intuitively, to try to understand the pilot, to try to support his actions, to understand his intentions. How does it really work? So here's the basic idea. Before going any further, here's the idea behind the C-star equation. We say that when the pilot operates the controls, let's take a classic airplane. Forget about the Airbus. Let's even take a DR-400 or a Cessna from an aero club, or any classic airplane. When the pilot pulls back on the control stick, for example, what is the sensation? What sensation will signal his brain? Be careful, you're acting correctly, or be careful, you've overdone it, or be careful, you haven't pulled back enough on the stick, you haven't pushed enough. What is the feeling? Because that's how you fly a plane. We even used to say, you fly it by the seat of your pants. But what is this feeling that we experience in our body? The feeling is called the load factor, which is acceleration. That means if a pilot pulls on the stick, if he pulls too abruptly, for example, his head will tend to sink into his shoulders. Then he'll feel like he pulled the stick too hard. On the other hand, if he pushes on the stick too abruptly, he'll go into 0G. That means his arm will float in the air. If he has a pen somewhere, it will float up. Dust floats up, and any unsecured objects float up in the cockpit. That's what happens when you overdo it. So they said to themselves, with the C-star law, we're going to control it. We're going to create a variable that will be controlled by the pilot when he pulls or pushes on the stick. And this variable will mainly act on the load factor. That means when he pulls, the computer understands that he's requesting a load factor. That's great, but it's not enough. He has a problem with it. That's what I'm saying. Compared to a car, for example, if I'm in a car when you're driving, imagine you're taking a big turn or something at highway speed. How do you know if you overdid it, are going too fast, or being too aggressive with the steering wheel? It's about acceleration. In a car, it's lateral acceleration. It's when you are. If you feel like you're doing this like this, to hold on, to stay upright, it means maybe it's time to ease off the accelerator a little, or maybe be a bit less aggressive with the steering wheel. That's what we call the load factor, okay? Still, if I stick with my car example, what I said is true on a highway and to some extent on a national road. But does that apply in a parking lot? If I start parking here now, if I back up this car and start driving around in this parking lot, is it really? Would I react to a load factor? There's no more load factor. The load factor is very low. The acceleration is very low. Instead, I will react to a change in direction of my car. So for airplanes, it's the same. They thought like this. At high speed, it will be the load factor that will be dominant. It's more like this that the pilot will react. So it's this. It's a load factor that the pilot has to control when he moves the stick. If he's flying at low speed, we won't be able to control the plane by load factor. We'll control it by pitch attitude instead. When he pulls on the stick, it means we're going to give it a nose up or nose down attitude. It's proportional to his stick action. See, we're getting the idea. So of course, like with all these laws, you can't switch from one to another, from one mode to another, abruptly. We'll have to do it gradually, in a way that takes into account all the intermediate steps between the load factor and the attitude. At that point, they will create, this law will unfold. So the C-star law, what is it equal to? It's equal to this. At first, it's equal to the load factor. I'll call it F, as experienced by the pilot. That's a load factor, an acceleration. I can also write it here, pilot in small like this. All right, that's the load factor felt by the pilot. More, let's say a speed. This speed is constant, by the way, which we'll call voltage controlled oscillator. So what is the voltage controlled oscillator speed? I told you we're going at high speed. From a weighting that gives 100% preference to the load factor at low speed to a weighting that favors pitch variations. There is a speed in between where both are weighted exactly the same way. That's what we call the voltage controlled oscillator when at voltage controlled oscillator speed. For an A320, it's 210 knots. For all Airbus planes, it's just over 200 knots. 210, 220, or 230. It depends on the Airbus. So at a certain speed, we weight it exactly the same way in the C-star law. We will weight the variations in load factor. We will weight the load factor exactly the same way as we weight the pitch variations. Okay, so multiplied by change in pitch, I write the first derivative, S dot. That means it's the rate at which the pitch changes divided by G, which is a constant, which is Earth's gravity. Okay, that's the law. C-star, as it was originally designed by National Aeronautics and Space Administration. You already noticed something. You notice a little problem it has. The speed R is not included. You notice that we've been purely in the inertial frame all this time. Even here, we're discussing acceleration and the constant speed of a given plane. We're discussing a change in pitch and the rate at which it changes, which is also inertial information. I have fixed information. So basically, there's no speed there. Okay, this will have consequences, important consequences for the plane, but there will also be regulatory consequences. So what will happen? Airbus, he will take this law and he will just add a detail, something. He will add a detail. He will multiply all of this by what I will call GV, by a gain depending on the speed. That's all. What is the gain depending on the speed? It's simply that Airbus will decide to create a kind of factor that will make it. So if we go at high speed, we'll go easy on the moving surfaces. The onboard computer will control the movements, cautious on the control surfaces. And when the plane is slow, it will command much larger movements on the control surfaces. All right, that's what gain does according to speed. So that's where Airbus will add speed to law CN3, okay? Airbus debuts the A320 in 1988, and that's where this law will be implemented, of course, with some small changes that will even, I would even tell you that it has only evolved since then. You even take several generations of Airbus, even you take an A320, one was made in 92 and another in 2002 or 2012. Their regulations aren't exactly the same. There are little details, little variables that change here and there, but the principle is there with us. Okay, what is it? What's the issue with this law? What does it provide as a plan? It gives a plane, when we work with the C-Star law, here's my A350. My A330 is similar but smaller. It's a law that gives a plane, which is very stable in pitch but unstable in speed. I will explain what it is and I will explain what it means from a regulatory standpoint. So what does that mean? If you have an Airbus and, oh, the engine is already gone. If you have an Airbus and you pull on the mini stick, the Airbus will pitch up. According to the law in its stars, so it will pitch up, okay? And then if you let go of the mini stick, what will it do? The Airbus, it won't return, it'll remain pitched up. All right, it will stay pitched up. What happens when you pull on the mini stick? The system, called auto trim on the Airbus, will automatically change the position of the adjustable horizontal stabilizer to adapt to what you just did. The Airbus stays where you place it, no matter what. If you let go, it remains in that position. The corollary is that we get an aircraft that is said to be unstable in speed, which does not have longitudinal stability. What does that mean? I've been telling you this all along. If we look at the AFA regulations, which later inspired the European Union Aviation Safety Agency certification rules, and those of other countries, if we look at the European Union Aviation Safety Agency certification rules, there is a requirement. There is a fundamental requirement. It's a requirement for stability and speed. What does that mean? It means that we say a plane must return to its speed on its own. If there's any disturbance, whether meteorological, external turbulence or otherwise, or if the pilot suddenly moves the controls and disturbs it. Well, what does that mean in practice? It looks like this. When he has just certified a 737, for example, they put it in level flight, it's balanced, so it's perfectly trimmed. And then they do this. The auditor notes the speed at which the plane is flying. The pilot pulls on the control column. At that moment, the control column is heavy because the plane doesn't want to leave its stabilized speed. The plane wants to stay as it was. The Airbus, being a conventional plane, won't do that. If you move it, it'll go along with you. If you pull on the stick will be heavy. If you let go, what will happen to the speed? Pulling the stick slows you down. What happens if you release it? It will return to its position and the speed will gradually return to its previous value. This is known as speed stability. This applies to a DR400 from the Aero Club or a Cessna 152. The auditor, who is there for the aircraft certification, checks two things. He checks that the speed, if we're in cruise configuration, returns to plus or minus 7% of its original value. If we're in landing position or configuration with the flaps extended, for example, the speed must return to plus or minus 10% of its reference value. He also checks something else. He checks that for every 6 knots of speed variation, there is at least a 1 pound force. That's about 500 grams on the controls. That means the more you pull, the more you move it away from its reference speed, the heavier the controls will become. When you take a classic plane, when you take a 737 and pull on the yoke, it's very heavy. After a while, the further you move it from its original balance, the heavier it gets. It wants to return to it. And what do we have to do to put it back into a new balance? Well, we're going to work with the TRIM. That means there are buttons on the control stick, and that's going to move, or we're going to manually move that surface. to rebalance the plane at a new speed. That's actually what we're doing. It's a bit like Windows. You delete a file and it asks you, are you sure? It's a way for the plane to ask you, are you sure? You want to rebalance it at a different speed? So pull on the stick, it's heavy. And if you want it to become light, if you want the plane to stop, to want to go back to where it was before, you'll have to work with the TRIM to tell it you know what you're doing. And I'd like to reach a new balance at a new speed. That's what we call planes that are balanced, or rather that are stable in speed. They always want to go back to their original speed. The Airbus, by these very laws that you see here, inertial, I am purely inertial here, I am purely inertial, forgetting the gain. Basically, it does not take speed into account, it has no speed stability. Perfect. When it comes to certifying Airbus aircraft, there is still a problem. The Airbus planes will be configured, or rather not configured, they will be certified. According to specific rules, that means according to exceptional rules. If you look in the United States at the Federal Register, which is a kind of official journal, you will regularly see Airbus requesting exemptions from existing rules in order to certify Airbuses. So, the instability in speed of an Airbus means that if you pull on the control stick, if the plane is balanced like this and you pull on the control stick, there is very little effort. It's not 6 pounds per, it's not 1 pound per 6 knots. It's nothing at all. It's a spring. It's the control stick. It has a spring. This spring gives the same feedback as the plane, whether stationary or in flight, matching what you feel at the control stick. It's a joystick, right? So if you pull on the stick, if you leave the plane at 10 degrees of pitch, it will maintain that pitch. What will it do at speed? The speed will start to decrease. Until when? Until the stall. Normally, okay, that's the classic. It's a classic. Planes that are said to be managed by the star law. So we're going to see how Airbus will respond to this in order to get the exemption. He's gonna do something special. 2 things that need to be done. 3 hands. First, he will set stall alarms. Do you want some? You can see here there are alarms. There's the stall alarm, and there are speed alarms. Low energy. It also doesn't play in every mode. There are alarms that exist. There are plenty of alarms on the Airbus, but it's not enough. The alarms alone wouldn't have allowed for an exemption. There's something else. There are envelope protections that are mandatory, even in military aircraft that use the C-star law. Here are so-called envelope protections. What does that mean? The plane constantly monitors the pilot and detects if, for example, they're about to stall. It has to take control of the situation. It has to respond to it. And for example, it goes full throttle and stops the pilot from pulling up further to prevent him from leaving the flight envelope. Because we know that with this law on these planes, it's easier than on others, and you can really feel it. By accident. Getting out of a 737's flight envelope is very difficult. Why? You have to pull on the control column. Just pull. It gets heavier and heavier, heavy, until you have the control column against your chest. Literally, it's extremely heavy. You need enormous arm strength to hold it, to make it stall, whereas an Airbus makes it stall automatically. I'm not talking without protection. You can make it stall effortlessly. You don't even realize you've made it stall. You pull and hold the stick, then release it. After that, it handles everything until the stall. So, knowing this Airbus difficulty, I was saying go install protections, which are envelope protections. So the envelope protections that are on Airbus. These are not protections that are optional. They're not there like a heated seat in a car. Like, yeah, well, it's a nice option. It's cool. No, these are necessary corollaries. These are mandatory corollaries. And that we literally make substantial to the Airbus. Anything else that Airbus is going to do? In terms of procedure, Airbuses are flown with the auto thrust engaged system. All the time, almost all the time, the pilots line up and take off. A few seconds later, they see climb, climb, climb. That means take your hands off the throttle, but click them onto climb. So they bring their hands back to the throttle onto a sort of groove. Click, climb. They took off, for example, at maximum power. So they're taking off. Well, after a while, they've got climb. So click, click, and there you go. The levers are on climb. From that moment on, they're going to stay in that position throughout the entire flight, including during landing. When the pilots disengage the autopilot, the levers still remain in the climb position. And then right up until the very end, when they get to about 20 feet above the ground, when the plane starts to say retard, retard, that means bring the levers back to idle. Well, on Airbus, we want the auto thrust control system to be active the whole time. That's actually to provide artificial speed stability. That means if you're manually flying an Airbus, you pitch it up, for example, by 5 degrees. Knowing what I just said, it's supposed to lose speed. So you pitch it up, you let go of the mini stick, and it will stay pitched up by 5 degrees. It should lose speed in theory, but not in practice. Since the auto thrust system is always engaged, even when you're flying manually, the auto thrust will add thrust to keep you at the speed you had before. So actually, what's extraordinary about the Airbus, and that's what makes it easy, is the fact that you have a plane that becomes ultra stable. It's super stable. It's stable not only in pitch, but it's also stable in speed. So it's super easy to fly. It can be flown effortlessly. So these kinds of devices are great. They're really good to begin with. But they actually have two problems and a first corollary. It's said, though I'm not sure people realize it, but it's said that when ABS came out on cars, it's said that at first, braking was extremely difficult for some people. And there were even accidents. Why? Because there were accidents. Because people were telling themselves, now I have more powerful brakes, I have more effective brakes. I can now allow myself things I couldn't before. The end result was he ended up off the road. That means ABS brings safety within reach, but only if you keep driving carefully, just like you did before. Now, if ever we have an increase in safety, but it's accompanied by an increase in recklessness, we haven't gained anything. It's like the economic theory that says expenses always rise. To match income, you compare people's earnings. Over 10 years, for example, it may double or triple. And you see that always at the end of the month, they have difficulties because expenses have increased. To match the income, we can theorize something similar. In terms of security, we mean that carelessness always increases to match the new security measures that have been put in place. So, for example, in this case, if we say that because the plane is easier to fly, because the plane has electronic assistance in all directions, that, for example, pilots are trained less. You see that in this context, we will end up with problems. That means we brought in elements that increase safety on one side, but we compensated for them. Somewhere by a penalty related to pilots who manage their aircraft less well, somehow, because somehow flying a shrub is a bit like singing through auto-tune in a way, because the pilot's actions are interpreted by banks of computers, which will smooth out movements, correct them, add normally absent stabilities like speed stability, and even assist. If you want to go outside the flight envelope, they will try to protect that envelope and keep the plane strictly inside it. So, if we're not consistent about these things, we could get into trouble with security that hasn't improved and may have worsened, okay? Let's move on a bit now regarding that. If we look at the report, in the accident report of France 447, I'm on page 193, there's something interesting. What is the BA going to say? I'll read it to you. When no protection exists, the aircraft does not have positive longitudinal static stability. even when approaching stall. What I'm saying is, this is the corollary of the law. It's the key point. You don't have stability, even when approaching stall. This absence is particularly reflected in the fact that it is not necessary to have or to increase a nose-up input to accompany a loss of speed by keeping the aircraft level. On a 737 or a Deer 400 from the Flying Club, when you want to test the stall, you reduce the throttle and you want to keep it level. Because when you reduce the throttle, what will the plane do? It will sink, and you prevent it from sinking by pulling on the stick. So the slower it gets, the more it sinks. So with the stick in the same position, if you do nothing, it will sink. So you pull back again, it slows and reaches a new balance. Then what happens? It will sink again, and you must keep pulling. And the stall will happen literally when you're pushing against the stick on an Airbus. To make a stall happen, you don't need to keep pulling gradually. You just need to take it out of balance. Out of the balance it was in. Take it out, let it go, do nothing. It will eventually stall at some point. If there's no protection, of course. As the report says, this low-speed behavior, even if it may seem contrary to some of the basic regulations I just described, was deemed acceptable by the certification authorities by taking into account special conditions and particular interpretations. Indeed, the presence of flight envelope protection makes a neutral longitudinal static stability perfectly acceptable. All right. That's why I was telling you that the protections on Airbus are not like heated seats. These are protections that are inherent to the Airbus. And if the Airbus was presented for certification, without these protections, it wouldn't pass. There's no reason to certify it. Okay, now, that was within the field, you know. To understand Air France 447, you need a multidisciplinary approach, discussing regulations, engineering, piloting, and more. If we look at piloting or the Airbus manual, what is the piloting law as it is presented to the pilot? If you ask any Airbus pilot, he will tell you that the fundamental law used by Airbus is what is called the normal law. The normal law... What is the normal law? The normal law is the C star plus protection law. That's right. The normal law is the Airbus flight law. Most of the time. Fortunately, yes. It's the law that uses the C star law, and it adds the protections I just described. So envelope protection, for example, pitch protection, nose-up protection, load factor protection, stall protection, overspeed protection, etc. That's why it's protections with an S. Okay, there are a lot of protections. Okay, now, the problem is that these protections you see here with an S, some protections are inertial protections, and some protections are air or aerodynamic protections that you see it. For example, inertial protection, that's the load factor. If we try to brake the plane, the aircraft will stop us and eventually warn us we're going too far, and it will no longer take the pitch up command into account. For example, if we're too rough, okay, those are called inertial protections. There are also protections called air protections. There's an alarm out there. The universe is too noisy, the one we live in. The universe is too noisy. What I'm going to do, I'm going to move this vehicle somewhere else and I'll resume. Okay, I'm moving the vehicle somewhere else and I'll resume. I can't concentrate, so it's not possible. We were discussing the normal law. Remember, I'm moving. I'm finding another place. Okay, and then I'll get back to you in 5 minutes. Here we go again. I moved the vehicle a little bit. So we were talking about the normal law of the Airbus. It's called the C star law. plus protection. In terms of protection, I mean inertial protection and air-related protection. So air, for example, that's in relation to overspeed protection or stall protection. Okay, now what happens if we ever lose it? If we ever lose the R references, if, for example, we can no longer access the speed, what happens on an Airbus? If the speed is lost, it can happen. The speed is calculated by computers that use sensors which are outside. These sensors are unfortunately prone to icing, can get blocked, and so on. So what we're going to do is assume that it's likely we could lose the air protections. So if we lose the air protections, what happens? We still keep the C-star law, because the C-star law we don't need a lot of information. Air. So that's fine. We're going to keep the protections, but actually we're only going to keep the protections that are inertial. The air protections, they are lost. There's no more air protection. And what do we call this law? We call it the alternative law. Alternative law. So the alternative law, it's a law that's quite similar to the normal law. Actually, it's more like the pure C-star law than the normal law. In reality, the alternative law, is the most delicate law in terms of control on a tree. It's the most difficult law to manage because it's a law that will create a non-conventional aircraft, but without stability assistance. So really, it's the toughest, the hardest, the trickiest law to use if we haven't been clearly trained on it. If ever, we still maintain protections like the load factor and similar measures. If ever we lose the inertial references, well, let's imagine that the inertial references are lost. We no longer have those stars to use since C-stars need inertial references. So if we lose those on an Airbus, we're stuck. We switch to direct law. What does direct law mean? In direct law, C-stars no longer exist or hold. We're going to have our Airbus that goes directly, which will connect the side stick directly to the flight control surfaces. It will also enable direct control of flight surfaces. Without stability or instability, just no artificial stability either. That means the Airbus will start to look more or less like a 737. Is the easiest law to use? Because in a certain sense, if the plane is diverted, if the Airbus is diverted from a speed where it was stable, the pilot has to adjust the trim himself to restabilize it at a new speed. Okay, so there's a much healthier behavior in direct law than in alternate law. Once again, if we're in alternate law, if you present an Airbus, for example, or any aircraft, and it uses an equivalent law, Airbus, it's not certifiable. Okay, it's not certifiable because the authorities think, and rightly so, that planes that operate only under C-star law without protection or with minimal protections, the authorities think so. Those planes are dangerous, okay? They're so dangerous that we wouldn't even want to certify them. The Airbus is certified like this, not like that. Okay, that's a degraded mode. Okay. I think now we're clear. Yes, maybe a detail. Remember, when I talked about the C-star law of the Airbus, I said that the control gain, the gain here, depended on the speed. All right, what do we do in alternate law for the gain? What do we do with the gain? Oh yeah, because the gain depends on the speed. What do we do? So we do two things. We're going to assume, we're going to be as conservative as possible. We're going to use a fairly high speed and say that if I don't have access to the speed, well, I'll base it on a gain which would be equivalent to a speed of 330 knots, okay? So we'll go with 330. I can't measure the speed, but I'll just say it's 339. Whatever, let's call it 330. And if ever the landing gear comes out, what do? We switch to direct law. That way we give. Because if the landing gear comes out, we use it as a marker or as an indicator. This isn't completely true, not 100% true for all Airbuses, all versions and everything. But generally, that's how it works on these types of aircraft. It's that if the landing gear is ever down, that means now we won't be able to use the C-star law anymore. We are now reaching very low speeds and it's becoming critical. We're starting to get close to the end, let's say, of the flight envelope from below. So at that point, what do? We're just going to abandon the C-star law and switch the plane to direct law. That's why on many Airbus planes, when the landing gear is deployed, while they're in alternate law, they switch directly to direct law and they abandon the C-star law. So I think now the context has been well clarified. Let's return to the night of May 31 or June 1, 2009. We have our plane taking off, and during the night, after a while, it heads over the Atlantic. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and at that moment, in terms of crew, we have 2 co-pilots and a captain. It's a bit strange, yes, but since the flight is long, we have a slightly larger crew. These people might have done it, I don't know. For a Paris-New York flight, we would only have a captain and a co-pilot, but since we're doing a Rio-Paris, we add another co-pilot. The captain decides to rest, which is completely normal, nothing strange about it. He leaves, he exits the cockpit, and he's going to let 2 co-pilots are each seated. One takes his seat, and the other is sitting on the right. He's going to leave them there to handle things. The fate of the plane, actually, he doesn't talk much about it. The plane is programmed. The entire flight plan is entered into the flight management computer, and then everything is set. The onboard computer automatically feeds the systems. So basically, you just have to monitor, you just have to watch, observe. Small problem, there's a bit of turbulence. It's an area called the Intertropical Convergence Zone. It's a place where there are always squalls, there are always storm cells, and planes tend to weave for quite a distance between the storm cells as they see them on the weather radar. It's to ensure passenger comfort and avoid extreme turbulence. So both pilots are there, they turn off the lights in the cockpit and they turn on the plane's headlights to see outside. Why? Because they are at level 350. The maximum level indicated, the recommended max is 370. But they keep a margin which is quite commendable. They keep a margin compared to the maximum. We think the plane could have reached 370, but it remained at 350. And they look outside, and what worries them is that the clouds seem to be rising all the way up to them. It's always uncomfortable seeing clouds at 350, hoping to fly above the weather. Sometimes clouds rise to your level, and you can even fly into them. All right? And it can contain turbulence, it can contain currents, it can contain water and all that, especially in a supercooled state, and that's very troublesome. So I told the pilots to turn off the light. Orbit turns on the headlights outside and then decides to alter the course by about 12 degrees. They alter the course by 12 degrees to move a little bit away from the route, because they have to do it anyway. Everyone does it that night. All the planes that were in the area did the same thing. Some, even many more, took detours that were literally much wider than those of Air France 447. Suddenly it's 2:10:05. Without warning, without anything at all, without any sign. There are lots of alarms in the cockpit. The autopilot disconnects, the auto throttle disconnects. And then the plane tells them through the ICAM messaging system, we're in alternate mode. The plane has switched to alternate law. It happened instantly. They also lost the airspeeds. What happened? It's theorized that supercooled water, which happens, it's liquid water at extremely low temperatures, hit the plane. At that moment, there were also some pieces of ice, little chunks of ice bouncing like that on the front of the plane. There was even a strange smell of ozone. And actually, these combined weather phenomena ended up exceeding the probe's ability to de-ice. These are probes that are de-iced, but in this case, the de-icing system's capacity was exceeded. The probes freeze. What happens when the probes ice up? There is no more speed information. We switch from normal law. Since we lose the R values, we move to the alternate law. We're still in C star with some inertial protections, but without the R protections. Flight control gain is set for 330 knots. That's the first thing that happens. Second thing that happens, the altitude drops suddenly. So the altitude drops suddenly. Why? It's not that the plane went down. The plane didn't go down at all. It's instrumental. You should know this. On some Airbus and other planes, not just Airbus, the static probes, which are placed on the sides of the fuselage, there are 6 of them, get a bit of dynamic pressure on their front. Whereas normally they are placed perpendicular to the airflow, so they are only supposed to receive, or rather only the static pressure. They're not supposed to detect dynamic pressure. I mean, they're not supposed to sense the movement of the air. But still, sometimes they do receive a little bit of it. What do we do in that case? We create an electronic correction. That means what we're going to do is tell the onboard computer. You look at the speed, and depending on the speed, you will correct the static pressure detected by the probes. So there's a correction, because imagine a giant comes along, grabs onto an Airbus in flight and blows on the static pressure ports like this. What will happen to the altitude? It will suddenly drop, okay? It will drop. If we increase the static pressure, the altitude drops. So knowing this phenomenon of air coming in, dynamic air entering the static pressures, the Airbus systems create a correction of about 400 feet at that altitude and that speed. What happens when there's no more correction? What happens when there's no correction? What if you lose access to the speed? When you can't access the speed anymore, since the speed becomes invalid, the system stops correcting the static pressure. When it stops correcting the static pressure, what will happen? It will increase. Without subtracting dynamic pressure, static pressure rises. What does the altimeter do? It does exactly what I told you, as if it were a giant who blew like this. With static pressures, with static pressure intakes, the altimeter suddenly jumps down. Tack! That's something I wanted to add. Another thing I'm adding. When the Airbus that lost its engine again, when the Airbus switches to alternate law, on the lateral side, on the lateral plane, the controls are connected directly, the flight surfaces to the side stick. We switch to direct law laterally. Okay, because it's hard to manage the gain. I'm going to discuss gain 300, which is 330 knots. And we'll apply it to this plane, okay? But on this plane, it's a bit tricky because you need a huge variation in gain depending on the speed of the plane. And 330 knots of fixed gain wouldn't be effective. So what do? We go straight to direct law on the lateral side. What does that give? It means that the gain the pilot will feel during cruise is almost twice as high as what he would normally feel. It means his authority is greater. So even a small push on the stick makes the plane do this. Okay, so it's not a deal breaker. It's not something that would do that. It's not something that would flip the plane over, but it's quite abrupt. That means at first the plane is very smooth, very pleasant to fly. It's very intuitive. It follows the pilot's commands just as they intend them. He thinks he wants to go right, he lets go of the stick. And the Airbus will very gently and smoothly accompany this turn. Except that if we go through, we can see it directly on the side view. So the alternative law, this one on the side view, it's direct. On this side view, it's direct. What will happen? Just a small push on the mini stick is enough to give a pretty sharp movement to the ailerons. Yeah, that means that at the beginning, when the co-pilot who is sitting on the right says, "I have control," As soon as the autopilot disconnects, he says, I have control. He takes the mini stick, and since the plane was starting to drift a little to the side, he decides to correct it. And at that moment, he'll be surprised because it reacts quite sharply compared to his experience. Also, note there may be something else unsettling. If you look at this drawing I just made, alternative law, but be careful, it's a direct law laterally. That means I'm telling you about this. If I take the mini stick, I can move it back and forth. It can move from left to right. Okay, because I'm telling you, there's an inconsistency in the axis. That is to say, from front to back, it's in line. C'est étoile alternative, which is actually equivalent to a normal law without protection. But the behavior will remain. As long as you don't let go, you won't see any problem. And laterally, he will be in direct law. Okay, so it's as if you actually have two planes in your hands. That means that on the plan, when you pull or push, it's fine. You can go normally. You won't see any difference. There's no noticeable difference. It's fine going forward or backward. Still controllable as usual. On the left-right lateral side, it gets rough. It becomes pretty harsh. Whoa! Okay, you have to deal with it. You have to deal with it. You have to adapt. It'll take a little while to adapt, but while it's adapting, it's going to hit the limit. It's going to hit the limit on the left. It's going to hit the limit on the right. So the plane is going to rock its wings pretty sharply from one side to the other. Also, what it's doing, he's pulling on the control stick. He's pulling on the control stick. Why? He feels like he's falling. He probably has the feeling that he's falling. Two things likely encourage this feeling. The altimeter that clicks, dropping by 500 feet, 400 feet. The ice crystals hitting the windshield, forming a sort of tunnel. He goes very fast through that tunnel. He feels like the tunnel is heading toward the ground or something like that. In any case, there's an unfavorable interaction between the pilot and the plane. And what does the pilot do? He pulls on the control stick. He's going to pull and pull hard. That means he's going to go almost to the stop. Sometimes he'll go 2/3 of the way. He'll really pull sharply. He'll pull and keep the plane nose up. Airbus type planes, as we said, don't have natural speed stability. So the plane will help him. The trim will reset itself. It will start to adjust, nose up, nose up, nose up, until at some point it reaches 13.5 degrees nose up. When we found the trim's jack screw, the carriage on it, which is pushed by the jack screw, was in a position corresponding to maximum nose up. So the plane assists him. When he pulls the control column, the plane helps. They're designed to assist. The plane starts to gain altitude very quickly. It begins to climb. At one point, there was, I believe, 17.9 of carburet, 17.9 of carburet, 18 of carburet. Just to let you know, if it was a carburet that was reached during takeoff. The captain, he's taking it easy on the carburet. Take it easy, you're doing a bit too much. All right. A pitch of 18 degrees during takeoff is considered a bit aggressive. All right. Generally, they stick to 15 degrees. Here, we're at flight level 350. The plane is extremely close to its ceiling, and we have a pitch of 18 degrees. At times, the aircraft is climbing, and it's climbing very well. It's climbing at several thousand feet per minute, about 6,000 to 7,000 feet per minute. At times, what is he doing? He's trading speed for altitude. He's losing speed and gaining altitude. The maneuver to make an Airbus stall, I did it in an airline simulator. I've done several tests many times over the past few months to test this situation. The maneuver is completely unnatural. That's how it feels in that sense. You really have to pull back on the stick and keep it pulled back for a long time. And feel the energy of the plane decreasing and keep doing it. And you have to hear it. It doesn't happen because you pull by accident. You can pull for 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then you realize you're doing something wrong. You can stop and everything will be fine. You must insist. He'll persist for a long time. In fact, he will insist on rearing up for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, literally insisting. At first, the plane climbs. Of course, it climbs. It almost reaches level. It passes level 370. Then it goes toward level 380. It won't really reach level 380. Just a bit before level 380. This system will reach its limits. The plane will start to sink. It will start to slow down, to lose more and more speed. The speed is really lost. It will start to slow down. At the moment when he pulled on the stick, the plane was cruising fast. At the moment when it pitches up, it immediately starts losing speed while gaining altitude. After that, it will become slower and slower, slower and slower. And it's inevitable that at some point it will stall, and it will start to fall. The speeds remained inconsistent or invalid for about the first speed that came back. There are 3 completely independent systems, the left-right system and ISIS in the middle. They will come back between about 29 seconds for the first one that came back, up to 60 seconds, 61 seconds for the last one that came back. So they will all come back. After 1 minute, let's say all the speeds are valid. The co-pilot in the captain's seat on the left notices the problem and plans to say it. Maybe not enough. He will say the speed, your speed, your speed, something like that, but he will never say it with the necessary force for the situation. His colleague is making the plane stall while he's saying, yes, watch your speed. I mean, it deserved more than that. But still, the plane stalls and then it starts to fall. 90 seconds after autopilot was disconnected as the plane stalled and speeds normalized. The captain, who had been called and who also felt that something was wrong because the movements the plane was making did not escape the captain's notice. The captain arrives in the cockpit. Something astonishing is about to happen because the 2 pilots and the captain are going to experience 2 different stories. The problem is presented to these 2 groups in a completely different way. Subtitling: the co-pilot and the 2 co-pilots witnessed the situation as it unfolded. They witnessed the loss of speeds, the first alarms, all of that. Given the situation, they lost control of the aircraft. When the captain arrives, he didn't notice the speeds had vanished and were still being displayed. He arrives, the speeds are normal at that point, you see? He lacks that history. So he arrives and looks. And what should the situation of not looking be compared to? It should be compared to a plane that's extremely slow, that's about to stall. So the altimeter is dropping rapidly, and the variometer is going towards 10,000, 15,000 feet per minute. The speed displayed on the left, on the right, everywhere feels very low. The speed itself is very low. The plane is falling. It's a pure stall. There's nothing special in what the captain sees. He too will stay absent, not understand, and remain in the middle. They are watching and wondering what's happening. Several times the co-pilot who has control of the stick clearly says, I'm pulling back, yet I'm pulling back. I'm pulling back. He even says at times, Ustaz, we have to pull back. Come on, let's pull back. There, we're pulling back. And when his colleague tells him, at some point we're falling, he replies, yes, but still I'm pulling back. Still I'm pulling back. It's the fact that we're pulling back and it's falling. That's the idea. The idea is that if you have a stall and then you pull back, it falls even faster. If you stall a DR 400 from the flying club and keep pulling back, you'll drop like a stone. And the harder you pull, the faster you'll fall. All the way to the ground, there's no limit to this game. Unfortunately, none of the 3 men are going to catch on. They're just fascinated by this plane that's falling. And the other one, he's snapping. At times, he seems to have urges to push forward. And here, there's an ergonomics issue that's going to trap him once again. That is the Airbus system. When you're in alternate law, there's no protection against stall. However, there is a stall warning. The stall warning, there's a male voice, a man's voice that says, stall, stall, stall. That voice, it will sound, I think, 80 times during those 4.5 minutes while the plane is falling. So when the guy says, stall, you're about to lose lift. The plane won't help you recover from a stall. It only warns you. What does the plane do? The plane, it has angle of attack measurements. It has angle of attack measurements, angle of attack sensors, except below a certain speed, specifically under 60 knots, which is about 110 kilometers per hour. Below 60 knots, it considers its angle of attack values as invalid. This is to avoid false alarms while the plane is on the ground or accelerating during takeoff. So to prevent false alarms, these probes only work if they receive enough air in the face. So below 60 knots, the measurement is invalid. So below 60 knots, there's no alarm. What does that really mean? It means that when the pilot pitches the plane up and the speed drops below 60 knots, the stall alarm disappears. The speed disappears and the stall alarm disappears. There's no alarm. The plane falls. After a while, the pilot says to himself, hey, I'll push a little. So he pushes a little. As soon as he pushes, the plane picks up speed. The speed goes above 60 knots, which is a good thing. The readings are increasing now, which is excellent. At one point, it even goes up to 120, 130 knots, which is perfect. He just needed to hold it a bit longer and the plane would have lifted off. No, once the speed exceeds 60 knots, the alarm sounds again. Stall, stall, stall. What is he doing? Is he pulling back? The alarm kept sounding as the plane continued to fall. He sees a latitude. What does he do? He tells himself, I'll push again. He pushes gently, stalls, then pulls back. As the plane falls, so does he. Okay? So what's happening? Something else is going to happen. A confusion in the pilot's minds about what we call high-speed stall. At one point, the report mentions as if they were afraid of stalling at high speed. Let me show you. If you look at the first flying club lesson about how planes fly or how wings are in the air and all that. Okay, it looks something like this. We're going to draw you a wing like this. It may curve slightly upward, right? They'll explain about the air. When it gets here like this, it's going to speed up. When it speeds up, the venturi effect is going to lose pressure. The acceleration is about 30% compared to the remaining airflow. And actually, this is going to create a drop in pressure, right? Which is going to suck. Pull the wing upward. Awesome. That's really nice. Now, the problem is that this isn't completely true anymore for today's airliners. Why? Because due to this problem, in the 1950s and 60s, they found that when they reached about 75% of the speed of sound, they started to experience a significant degradation. In the performance of the wings showed little lift and a lot of drag. You could even experience what's called a high-speed stall. So afterwards, they did some research and they changed the wing. If you look at Airbus's wing, the wings of commercial airplanes are relatively flat. It's hard to draw, but they're relatively flat. On the upper surface, that's a supercritical airfoil. That means, in fact, these wings are much less prone to stalling at high speeds than conventional wings. The Airbus uses supercritical wings, so a supercritical wing, it's very, very, very difficult to achieve. It lacks the energy, engine, and power to reach a speed that would cause a high-speed stall. That doesn't exist, yet it's taught. Among pilots, it's taught. When you get to the flying club, well, there you go. There's low-speed stall and high-speed stalls. Pilots often believe they can stall both upward and downward, but stalling downward leads to many tragedies. You'll have a hard time meeting someone who stalled at high speed these days. It's almost a high-speed stall. I'm exaggerating a little bit. I'm African. I tend to caricature. It's almost an urban legend. This has been true for all Airbus planes since the 70s. So the pilots might have felt that it was going too fast and that they were experiencing a high-speed stall. And since stall is just something that's vaguely mentioned, somewhere in their minds, without them ever being exposed to training or anything like that, they felt like they were stalling because they were going too fast. Maybe. At one point he says, we're going insanely fast right now, because that's how it feels to him. Anyway, the plane, technically, and for a very long time, to be honest, was recoverable. It could have just needed to push the control stick, persist despite the stall alarm, and then it would have recovered. After a while, the speed would have started to increase, and then after that, it would have. They could have recovered it by avoiding the secondary stall. Nevertheless, what I'm saying here to a possible logical flaw in the story. Okay, there might be a logical flaw. I'll show you. I'm taking the performance of this crew or its pilots that day. What is it? The difficulty of not stalling a plane? I represent it with this little mountain. This is the difficulty. Despite the fact that they had this speed that went away, that came back randomly, these alarms, it would have been enough to keep the little bird on the horizon, to keep the plane more or less in the attitude it was in. And then, well, after a minute, things would have gone back to normal. And then that's it. We would have been scared. We would have said, wow, what was that? And everything. It was, you needed quite a bit of skill to keep it, but it's relatively easy. What's the difficulty? If I show it, in the mountains, how do you recover a plane from a severe stall at night and high altitude? Okay, so that's why I say it's a logical problem. What I just said, it's true, yes. If someone wasn't able to do it, wasn't able to cross that mountain, and if he made the plane stall, he won't be able to recover it if he made it stall. That means indeed there are pilots who can recover from this kind of situation, but those pilots in the first place, they don't go. Their performance means they won't lose them already. In any case, the Bureau of Inquiry and Analysis in its investigation will reveal that the Airbus A330 had quite a few problems with its probes, and that they found 13 cases that are mentioned in the accident report. There are some with Air France, with Qatar Airways, with a Brazilian company, TAM, and so on. With several with Air Caraïbes and so on. So they found several cases, 13 in total. 13 cases out of 9, 13 cases. Well, out of the 13, there were 9 where the stall warning sounded. Just to let you know that there are some, out of 13 crews, there were 9 who were very close to crashing, okay? Who started to lose control, but who reacted to the stall warning by pushing the nose of the plane down. By the way, there was even one crew who, right from the start, as soon as they saw they had lost everything, they didn't wait for a stall warning and immediately put the plane into a slight descent. Because if you put the plane into a descent, you're at 350. Losing 1,000 feet per minute gives you 35 minutes before hitting the sea. It's not like flying over the Alps. You have 35 minutes to observe, anticipate, understand, let the situation resolve, troubleshoot, or discuss it. The problem is pulling the stick as if avoiding an obstacle ahead. Sometimes we have crashes where people, they get ground proximity warning system alarms, they're heading towards terrain. They aren't as aggressive. Sometimes pilots react over the ocean, as seen here with Air Asia. Same, 320. I discovered it on this channel too. When he sees the first alarms, the co-pilot pulls back on the control stick and keeps it pulled back until the plane stalls. That's clear. So the plane is going to hit the sea at some point, let's say at level 100. When they were at level 100, the chances of recovery were extremely low. To be honest, I think that once they said, we're reaching level 100, that was with a descent rate of about 10 to 12,000 feet per minute. That means they had less than a minute to recover the plane. Honestly, I'm not completely convinced that they could have recovered it. Maybe they could have, maybe they couldn't, but I think they couldn't. At one point, the co-pilot says, but we're going to crash, and then a second later, they crash. That means the plane hits the water. 228 dead instantly. And then that's it. Some parts will float. They will be recovered in the following days, like the vertical stabilizer that was found 5 days later, floating between the waters. The image went around the world. It's the image that confirms the plane was lost. For those who still had any last doubts, vertical speed at impact was about 200 kilometers per hour, while horizontal speed was very low. The plane broke into several pieces. It didn't shatter like in some accidents where there's a lot of energy at impact. It fell like that abruptly, breaking into several pieces which immediately began to sink. 4,000 meters deep, 3,900, and that's it, and it caused 228 deaths. It's an accident. It's an absolutely terrible accident, and it's an accident that wasn't really necessary. I don't mean to criticize the pilots or anyone else, but I would say, really, if that day among the passengers there had been a hang glider pilot or a glider pilot or a pilot of a similar craft, he would have had a better chance of saving that plane. But you still need to understand the pilot's defense, that the alternative law is a law extremely close to the pure seed law, and that this law is very tricky. You have to know that. When the plane switches to alternative law, picture the letters C clearly in your mind. And you need to know that you have to be really careful with this law, and that you shouldn't try to gain altitude with this law. At the very least, you need to stay level. If you're too scared, maybe start descending like some people did. But don't try to do any extreme maneuvers, because this law lacks speed stability and can amplify mistakes. Any error will only make things worse. All right, there you go, my friends. That was Air France. I didn't want to go over what's already known. I wanted to give you a different perspective, to look at it from another angle. Thank you for watching until now, and we'll see each other in another video. Two little points I'd like to add before finishing. At Boeing, they use the C*U law, which was formulated at the same time as the C* law, but you mean speed. And actually, this law intrinsically includes the speed R, which is added in there to create natural speed stability. So if a pilot wanted to stall a Boeing aircraft like the 777 or 787, for example, he would have to pull on the control stick. On a stick that gets heavier and heavier, he would have to confirm his intention to destabilize them in this way by a repeated, continuous, and manual action on the TRIM. They don't use auto trim to reach this situation. So let's say it offers more protection than, for instance, an Airbus in alternate law. That's the first point. Second, remember the story about flight control gain? This gain, calibrated at 130 knots, is what happened as Air France 447 began losing speed. At times it was at 60 knots. You should know that even when it was at 60 knots, the gain was still equivalent to 330 knots. That means the controls started to respond as the speed decreased. The controls started to respond in a way that was more and more, let's say, sluggish in a way. At 60 knots, that really means he might have benefited from lowering the landing gear to switch the plane to direct law and maybe gain full control movement. But he would still have had to realize the situation as it was unfolding. They died never realizing they were likely stalling. Thank you, my friends, and then we'll see each other in another video.